Next is the Battle of Naseby, which was one of the many battles that took place during the English Civil War, and it wasn't even the last battle, but it was the battle that signalled the beginning of the end for the Royalists, as they were soundly beaten by the Parliamentarians, helped by their new model army. The English Civil War, by the way, just for a point of reference, was a war between King Charles I and his supporters, known as Royalists, and Parliament and their supporters, known as Parliamentarians. If we just stop for a minute to consider chronology and change and continuity, this battle was in 1645, which is over 200 years after the Battle of Agincourt, which was in 1415. And the Battle of Agincourt was just short of 200 years after the Battle of Hastings, which was a whopping 1,000 years after the Boudicca Rebellion and the Battle of Watling Street. These are all long periods of time that we sometimes struggle to get our heads around, but just think of how long you've been on the planet Earth. Agincourt had many features on the battlefield that were present at the earlier Battle of Hastings, like cavalry, archers, and a lot of infantry. Naseby had one major difference to all of the battles that came before it, and this was that it was the first battle that we study that involved the use of gunpowder. It was also the first battle since the Romans at Watling Street that involved a standing army, the New Model Army, which made up a portion of the Parliamentarian forces. Yes, that's right, it was not until the 1640s before England had its own standing army, which was to exist not just in times of war and fighting, but in peacetime too. That's what a standing army is. You should know this hopefully from your lessons. In peacetime, the New Model Army was paid to train, so that when a fight broke out, it would be ready. So the Parliamentarians had a bit of an advantage over the Royalists when they created their New Model Army. Now, although gunpowder was used in the Battle of Naseby for the first time in the battles that we've studied, it's not the first time in any battle, it had happened before, but of the battles we're studying, this is the first time there's gunpowder involved. But gunpowder did not actually decide the battle. Instead, it was all about the discipline of the armies and the control that the generals had over the armies. And in this respect, it was the Parliamentarians that came out on top. Naseby is different to many of the previous battles we have studied because the Parliamentarians had a larger army of 13,000 compared to 8,000 Royalists. And the Parliamentarians won. We've studied a few battles where outnumbered armies have won, but actually it's a bit misleading because most of the time numbers are decisive. As you can imagine, if you were to go out and have a fight now, if you were outnumbered, you'd probably expect you were at a bit of a disadvantage and might lose. It's exactly the same. So anyway, in this case, the Parliamentarians have got about 5,000 more men, and they happen to win. The battle opened with Parliamentarian cannon fire, so there's that gunpowder, which was an attempt to soften up the Royalists a bit. It's a new development for warfare to try and soften up the enemy with cannon fire, but unfortunately, the cannon technology was such that it wasn't particularly accurate, and the cannon shot too high and over the heads of the Royalists. So although this was a more devastating weapon by far than anything else on the battlefield, if it was actually hitting the enemy, it wasn't hitting the enemy because it wasn't particularly accurate, and in this battle the cannon, though it was there, didn't really have any effect. Muskets, which are guns by the way, and the guns that were used on the battlefield by parts of the two armies, well, they were quite slow to load, especially the early muskets. And because the armies were relatively close together, and that meant there was only really time for one shot or salvo before that's what you call it when you all shoot at once, it's a salvo, before hand-to-hand fighting took place. So again, although more devastating than other projectile weapons like arrows, the muskets didn't really decide the battle because for most of them they only really got one shot off before the vicious, gruesome, horrible hand-to-hand fighting took place. So what actually happened? King Charles I, like others we have studied, fought with less men than his opponent. He could have potentially actually waited, or tried to wait anyway, for a force of 5,000 that he'd sent off to go and attack a town called Taunton. That would have evened the numbers, but he didn't. Yeah, as we've seen, of course, being outnumbered doesn't necessarily mean defeat. Like we've talked about, Henry V at Agincourt made great use of the terrain he fought in to nullify the larger French forces. Charles did start in an advantageous position, just like Henry V, but although Charles I began the battle on high ground at the top of a bit of a hill, he ordered his troops to leave the high ground and attack the parliamentarian lines, or at least he wasn't able to stop his troops from leaving and starting the attack on parliamentarian lines. You might remember what happened to the Saxons at Hastings when they left the high ground in 1066. It isn't a good idea. Opposing Charles I, the commander, called Thomas Fairfax, took control of the parliamentarians, but it was actually the man in charge of a section of the army, the cavalry, Oliver Cromwell, that made the first and very clever move. He used part of the terrain intelligently. So I keep mentioning this word terrain. That just means the ground and where the battles fought. Anyway, Cromwell, in charge of the cavalry, used the terrain intelligently, because on the left of the battlefield was a long, very thick hedge, difficult to see through. And he sent a small force of dragoons. They're not fire-breathing mythical creatures or anything, but dragoons were sent to sneak behind the hedge and down to the side of the Royalist army, where they got into position and took the Royalist army by surprise by firing on them from the side, when all the Royalist troops were expecting to be perhaps attacked from the front. So what are dragoons? Well, they're cavalrymen. So they're soldiers on horseback who were lightly armoured, so they're quite quick, and they carried muskets, which are like some of the earlier guns. So the advantage of this, they're on horses and they're lightly armoured, they can move very quickly around the battlefield. And that meant they could take part in charges, and as in this case, they could also really harass and annoy the enemy, maybe into making a move that they don't want to make, because they could dismount from the horse, fire their guns, jump back on the horse and leg it really quickly, which is what they did here. So they snuck down the hedge, got off the horses, fired their guns and got back on and legged it. The action of the dragoons that Cromwell sent behind the hedges caused some of the Royalist cavalry to spring into action in a devastating charge on the parliamentarian lines, which actually caused some of the parliamentarian cavalry to flee from the battlefield. So the dragoons, it was a positive and a negative, because it caused some of the Royalists to leave the high ground, but actually the charge that they did, if you like, it caused such pandemonium in the parliamentarian lines that some of the parliamentarian cavalry, they legged it. But there was a big mistake that came, because they got this advantage, but the Royalists chased after those cavalry that had charged. They chased after the parliamentarians and left the battlefield as well. So they got the parliamentarians to leave, but then they'd kind of wasted their advantage by leaving themselves. And whilst they were off, they found the parliamentarians' supplies, which you would call the baggage train. So they came across the parliamentarians' baggage train and started to loot all the goodies that the parliamentarians had left behind, instead of riding back to the battle. Big mistake. And maybe a more disciplined force, like the New Model Army on the parliamentarian side, wouldn't have stopped to loot, and instead would have returned to the battle. Perhaps. But that's one disadvantage for the Royalists. They don't have a standing army. In the meantime, the battle was in full flow with gruesome hand-to-hand combat. Soldiers used musket rifle butts to batter their foes, or swords if they had them to cut and stab. The remaining Royalist cavalry tried to turn this even battle, because it was even, into their favour by charging the remaining parliamentarian cavalry. So the remaining horses on the Royalist side charging the remaining horses on the parliamentarian side. But Cromwell, in charge of the parliamentarian cavalry, who had excellent control of his disciplined troops, kept his cavalry at the top of a hill away from the battle. And this, coupled with the fact that the part of the Royalist charge took place across boggy marshland, meant that the impact when they got there, charging uphill, having just slogged through a bit of boggy ground, meant that the charge wasn't as devastating as it could have been. It did some damage, and the parliamentarians took a lot of casualties, but in the end, the Royalist cavalry had to run away, because the parliamentarians didn't give up. And this next bit is where this discipline thing I was talking about turned the battle, because the new model army made the difference. Cromwell was able to send off part of his cavalry to chase the Royalist cavalry away from the battlefield. But he kept some of the cavalry on the battlefield. He was able to split his forces. And so with the remaining cavalry force that he kept, the only remaining significant cavalry force left on either side on the battlefield, well, obviously he used it to charge into the flanks, into the sides of the Royalist infantry. So if we rewind to near the start of the battle, when some of the parliamentarian cavalry ran away, the whole cavalry force opposing them chased them off. But the parliamentarian new model army is much more disciplined and trained, so that when later in the battle the remaining Royalist cavalry fled, the parliamentarian cavalry was so disciplined as to be able to split their force, leaving the cavalry that remained as the only cavalry on the battlefield. The dragoons that had been sent behind the hedges on the Royalist left flank were still there, so the Royalist army ended up surrounded on three sides. There was cavalry on the right, there was dragoons, which is also cavalry on the left, and there was the bulk of the force in the front. So the Royalists, a bit surrounded, soon broke and began to run away in a desperate attempt to flee death. And the parliamentarians, especially those on cavalry, relentlessly chased them for 12 miles and killed any Royalist soldiers they caught. This battle is fairly unique in the battles we've studied, because it was less the actions of a general in charge of the army that decided the battle, it was instead the actions of a cavalry commander, Cromwell, who was only in charge of a portion of the army. And he made clever moves and exercised greater control of his forces than his enemy. So in contrast, the Royalist cavalry commander, who by the way was called Prince Rupert, didn't really make any subtle clever moves, and he failed to control his cavalry, with some of them leaving the field of battle and not returning because they'd found things to steal. And there we have it, the Battle of Naseby.